Reverend Father Rector, authorities of the Gregorian University, excellencies, and dear colleagues in Freds, it's a great pleasure to open the 20th Brenningmeier Wehrhahn lecture. A warm greeting to all those who have joined us in presence, and also to those who are following by Zoom. There's quite a few people who are also following online, and we'll try to have these people also participate during the debates. I hope this will work. And I don't know why I have to let them in. So we'll have a few words of salutation and introduction, and right away I leave the floor to Father Nuno da Silva Gonçalves, who is the rector of the Pontifical Gregorian University.
Signori ambasciatori, illustri autorità.
Mr. Ambassador, authorities, students, dear friends, I would like to warmly greet the participants to this Brenningmeier Wehrhahn conference, both the ones who are here and made it here today in presence, but also the ones who are remotely following us. Amongst the many initiatives of Cardinal Bea, we are having deeply in our heart the Brenningmeier Wehrhahn, which is today celebrating its 20th anniversary. This is because of the importance of the themes that are so important. This is a clear sign also of the collaboration of the Brenningmeier Wehrhahn family with our own university. We are so grateful for this collaboration, and this is the reason why I would like to greet with many thanks, Mrs. Brenningmeier, and we would like to express how happy we are for the honoris causa degree in theology that was conferred to her on September the 10th by the Faculty of Theology of the University of Rome. So many congratulations. Then a very warm greeting also to Professor Odol Ishai, director of the Center of Christianity of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Many thanks, Professor Ishai, for the collaboration that we are leading and conducting for so many years, which is so enriching for both all of us, professors and students. The collaborations amongst the professors, teachers, whether Jews and Christians, in the teaching and in scholar work, is at the very center of the daily work and activities of the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies. This is the pathway that we should be following and treading in order to deepen dialogue, friendship, brotherhood between Jews and Christians in the full acknowledgement of our mutual gifts. I already said this on other occasions, but I will say it again. The walking the same path done by Jews and Christians together is what we want to make visible and what we want to give witness of. This is a way to implement what was requested by Nostra Aetate, Council Vatican II, to the entire Church, and we follow the direction and the indications provided by different popes and with their own symbolic gestures. For example, the visits to the Roman synagogue that were started by Pope John Paul II. Pope Francis, when visiting the Roman synagogue in 2016, said that the Christians, in order to understand themselves, cannot not refer to their Jewish roots and origins. And at the time of the hearing of 2019 with Cardinal Bea Center, he wanted to state that dialogue has to be led forward with two different voices. This is the witness and the experience of Jewish and Catholic teachers and professors that teach together is worth more than many other speeches. And this was the word of Pope Francis. So this is the direction we should follow, the pathway that we should take in teaching and in research activities, thus having care of our own Jewish roots and having care to still nourish the life and the identity of the Church. This is the commitment of the Cardinal Bea Center. I would like to thank his director, Father Etienne Veteux, the teaching and academic staff for the perseverance and commitment with which they lead forward their own mission. And once again, let me welcome all of you from the deep of my heart with many thanks for your being here today in presence.
Thank you, Father Rector, for your encouraging words. It's always good to feel support from the institution, from the university. As Father Rector just explained, this is the 20th anniversary of the Brenningmeier-Verhan lectures. And since these lectures have been accompanying the Cardinal Bea Center since the start, it's also the 20th anniversary, 20th birthday of the Cardinal Bea Center. And we will also hear about the Center for the Study of Christianity, which is our partner organization at the Hebrew University, which started a bit before, but this also means that we're celebrating 20 years of partnership with the Hebrew University. The idea behind this evening, we'll be able to speak about it in the next introductions, but is to go from Jewish-Christian dialogue to Jewish-Christian studies. Dialogue and studies. Some have heard me about this already today, but I'm going to say a few words just to help us enter in what we want to do. As I often say, things have changed radically, very deeply, in the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people. And someone from the 1950s would never have imagined what we're living right now, what we're experiencing right now. And this has been 50, 60 years of dialogue. And dialogue means listening to the other, trying to understand the words, trying to understand what the desires also are. But we have a feeling that we are ready to slowly go towards another step, which is to study together. And studying together is another step of trust, in the sense that studying the same text together means to be able to be enriched by the tradition of the other, which means already to shift, because when we receive from the other, we shift. And it also means to let others speak about our texts, which is a further step shifting forward. So this evening, this is what we're going to listen to and try to participate in the sense that we will have a Jewish scholar, Amy Jill Levine, who will be speaking about the New Testament, which is normally our text. Of course, to make it safe, we've asked Professor Pino Di Lucio to respond. And we've also asked, on the other side, Professor Father Christian Rütishauser to speak about a contemporary Jewish author, Solevici. And here, also to make it safe, we have Professor Ben Yohanan, who will be giving a response. But before doing that, I want to add one thing about the date today, and then we will have two introductions. The date today is the 9th of November, 2021. 2021 was because of the 20th anniversary. 9th of November was just a question of convenience. But the 9th of November is a date that has a lot of historical meaning. And in particular, there was the Crystal Night, Kristallnacht, in 1938, and also in the same city of Berlin, the fall of the Wall of Berlin on the 9th of November, 89. And without making this overly dramatic, I think this shows us that some historical events have a huge impact on humanity, and some of them for good and some of them for bad. And that we have choices to make, and we hope and wish that, of course, the Cardinal Bea Center and the Center for the Study of Christianity are tiny drops of water in the ocean of history, but we hope that we are together making choices that are for the good of humanity. As I said, there will be two introductions, more precisely to this evening. Some of you have received the program with the name of Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State. That was a former version of the program. Unfortunately, Cardinal Parolin could not be here tonight, but he is, with the Secretary of State, a constant support of the Bea Center. And we have asked instead, in a certain way, of Cardinal Parolin, Professor Yuval, so we're going, Professor Yuval of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, to give us an opening statement explaining how he understands our step, both the anniversaries that we're celebrating and also how to look forward. And then Mrs. Aldegonde Brenningmeier-Verhan, who will also give her take on what has been the past of these 20 years and how she sees the future for our work in common. Professor Yuval is known by many here. He is professor of history at the Hebrew University, academic head of the Mandel School for Advanced Studies, and also of the Teddy Kollek Chair for Cultural Studies of Vienna and Jerusalem. And I could say, even more important, he is a friend, personal friend, and a friend of the Cardinal Bea Center, and I'm very happy to leave him the floor for this first introduction. Professor Yuval, the floor is yours. So it will be by Zoom. Yes, thank you.
Reverend Father Rector of the Gregorian University, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, and friends of the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies, mon cher ami Professeur Etienne Veteux, last but not least, dear Mrs. Aldegonde Brenningmeier, ladies and gentlemen. For 2,000 years, Judaism and Christianity lived side by side. It was a time of ongoing controversy, during which each side sought to justify its belief and deny the other side's belief. It was a time of a struggle for identity and metaphysical truth. It was a long story that has had known ups and downs, periods of persecutions and periods of tolerance, with one victorious and universal religion that captured the hearts of peoples living in their own lands, pitted against a humiliated religion limited to a single nation living in exile far from its homeland. It is, however, important to recall that despite their humiliations and sufferings, Jews were the only non-Christians to be tolerated in medieval Christian Europe. This was the case because the Church clearly desired to let Jews live within its realm. As St. Augustine wrote, the boundaries of the spread of Christianity match the boundaries of the Jewish diaspora. And where there were no Jews, there were no Christians. Precisely today, as Etienne, Professor Veteux mentioned, when we mark the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht, we must remember that there was no Auschwitz in the Middle Ages. We are now embarking on a new era. The controversy is over. Christians no longer deny the foundations of the Jewish faith. They acknowledge its validity, respect its traditions, and its reading of the Holy Scriptures. Jews are still somewhat hesitant. The baggage of the past and the sense of victimhood will not soon fade. Yet, certain Jewish circles, among them intellectuals, artists, and liberal rabbis, do feel comfortable with the lowering of the barriers. The common denominator turns out to be greater than what separates. Unfortunately, the tension with contemporary Islam has also contributed to increasing closeness between Jews and Christians. I'm not speaking here as a representative of the Jewish religion. I'm an academic, and in my opinion, academia has taken an active role in leading the new phase of interreligious understanding. The role of research in the humanities is not only to produce new knowledge, but also to educate. The critical approach and comparative methodology produce by their very nature a broader understanding between people, cultures, and religions. Research promotes interreligious understanding. So it comes as no surprise that the most significant Jewish response to Nostra Aetate took place, in my opinion, in academic circles. The prevailing perception among Jewish scholars of Christianity has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. We are witnessing an unprecedented flourishing of studies on the dialogue and polemic between Jews and Christians in such diverse areas as Talmudic literature, midrash, medieval literature, art, religious thought, liturgy, religious custom, and festivals, and many others. Simultaneously, Christian educational and research institutions are showing growing interest in studying Jewish texts with an intellectual openness. While Christian scholars are no longer intimidated by reading Jewish texts, the research discourse has made Jewish scholars recognize that Judaism was also influenced by Christianity. Indeed, the research of the last generation shows that major chapters in Jewish thought were born out of both the friction with and the absorption of Christian ideas. There are those who see this as undermining Jewish authenticity, but it can also be seen as an achievement of a single monotheistic religion which had had a sense of superiority over pagan religions, but which later came to terms with a second monotheistic religion and even learned to draw new ideas from it and weave them into its own tapestry. The conversion of Christian ideas and their assimilation into Jewish thought can be perceived as evidence of a dynamic and creative religion. In the past, scholars were among those who added fuel to the fire of hatred and tension between the two religions, while the common people learned to live side by side. Synagogues stood alongside churches in the medieval city, and the buzz of the noisy Jewish prayer was sometimes heard during the silence of the Christian service held in a nearby church. Hostility was kindled by writers, by preachers, by the intelligentsia. Today, scholars on both sides are leading in the opposite direction. We are now ready to take the next step and to go beyond Jews studying Christianity and Christians studying Judaism. We are ready to move towards having working groups in which Jewish and Christian scholars meet together for the purpose of the joint study of texts related to each religion. In the first half of the 20th century, only Christianity and Islam were studied at European universities, not Judaism. Therefore, it was only natural that when the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was founded in 1925, the very first academic institution it chose to establish was the Institute of Jewish Studies. The establishment in 1999 of the Center for the Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University closed the circle when the first Jewish university found it fitting to establish in Jerusalem, in the cradle of Christianity, a center for Christian research. This undertaking was made possible by the generosity of two people full of inspiration and goodwill to increase peace and love in the world. Mr. Hubert Brenningmeier, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be blessed, and his wife, Mrs. Aldegonde Brenningmeier, the two patrons of the center. The cooperation between the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies at Pontifical Gregorian University and the Center for the Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University is charged with symbolic meaning. In the remote past, when the tension between Judea and Rome was at its peak, the Talmud formulated the following rule, I quote, "When Rome flourishes, Jerusalem sinks. When Rome sinks, Jerusalem flourishes." The sages of the Talmud could not have imagined the possibility that Jerusalem and Rome would lead a joint venture that would place both of them together in a position of leadership. Yet, this came true in our days, a generation after Nostra Aetate. I'm sorry that I'm unable to be with you in person today, but I take comfort in speaking from Jerusalem and wish you success at this evening in Rome. The Talmud also says, I quote, "The learning of scholars increases peace in the world." This is a promise as well as a vision and a mission. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Yuval, Israel, for, in a certain way, we are sad that you were not able to be here in presence, but symbolically, the fact that you're speaking from Jerusalem really does mean something, and you're giving us hope by showing us that Jerusalem and Rome can actually flourish together. As Professor Yuval also said, Hubert and Aldegonde Brenningmeier are founding members of both the Center for the Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University and of the Cardinal Bea Center. Probably the Cardinal Bea Center would not have existed without Hubert and Aldegonde. And so it's really my great pleasure to introduce Aldegonde Brenningmeier. She also works in other fields, of course. For example, she has co-founded a network called Women in Danger on behalf of Caritas Catholica in Germany and Belgium. And right now, especially, she's founder and director of INTAMS, which is the International Academy for Marital Spirituality. Aldegonde would be very happy to hear also your take on this anniversary.
And also the story, partly the story of this center and especially the center in Jerusalem. But I'm very glad that I can tell you also something which you have not heard yet. Good evening, and thank you, Director Father Nuno, for your kind words. and also Israel Yuval. I don't know if he will hear me. He is a very old friend. He is a very old friend already from quite some time. Thank you, Israel, for your wonderful talk and speech, and I hope to see you soon in Jerusalem. Thank you also to the speakers who came specially to have this dialogue, but not a dialogue, but really to enter now into the study. So, therefore, it is my pleasure to address a few words of joyful gratitude, especially at this moment of the 9th of November. It had its beginning like a little seed in 2001 here. 1.5 years before that, my husband Hubert and I were permitted to sow a similar little seed at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. But before I speak about the 20th anniversary of the Cardinal Beer Center of Judaic Studies, I would also like to mention at this moment my husband, who is really missing. And he supported this whole event, and so I'm very grateful that we could do this together. Like the little mustard seed in Matthew 13, the Beer Center has become 20 years later a strong tree that has grown tall, a fine-grained and beautiful tree. This mustard seed today bears the name Cardinal Beer Center of Judaic Studies at the Gregorian University. Along with the Center for the Study of Christianity in Jerusalem, this mustard seed was the smallest seed in the university landscape. We sensed at that time, both in Jerusalem and in Rome, how fragile this seed of dialogue at that time is and its beginning, and how much care and love it needs in order to become a tree of life that invites us and that sows the path in order to permit the tree continuously to grow. These various directors in Jerusalem and in Rome can bear witness of this today. I would like, therefore, to take the opportunity to express to all directors up to now my profound gratitude for all the years in which they have committed themselves with vitality and constancy to let this little seed grow into a mature tree with a broad crown and with many branches that spread wide to reach even the other continents. Some of these powerful branches in the International College of the Professors have been remarkable birds, if I may this metaphor, that could make their nest there with academic knowledge and with devotion. In Jerusalem, it was at that time, in the beginning, Guy Strumsa, David Satran, Bruya Ashkelani, and today, Odette Irshai. And here in Rome, there were Arairos Grolius, Joseph Sievers, Tom Casey from Ireland, Philip Ranches, and today, Etienne. And this year after year, that impressed me greatly and awoke a number of questions much later. Thanks to my studies in Leuven, my husband and I came to recognize that these two religions were inseparably linked together. Jesus and his family were genuine sons and daughters of Israel, as were his disciples. The first Christians were all Jews. Peter declared the Messianic confession and as a believing Jew. Paul strove passionately until the end of his life to form a united community of Jews and Gentiles. After many, though, negotiations at the First Synod of Jerusalem, the ground was laid for the future with Jews and Gentiles Christian to equal members. But Jews and Christian, little by little, parting their ways after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70. Sadly, the conflict intensified, and Christian anti-Judaism made a central contribution to a cruel persecution and annihilation of Jewish men, women, and children. More and more Christian and Jews became, unfortunately, strangers. Against this background, that my husband and I felt called in 1989 to travel more frequently to Israel in our holidays in order to get to know and to appreciate our oldest brothers and sisters. We were both working, but as far as we could, we continued our studies in a private invitation by the very well-known Professor Josef Burg, year after year. We deepened our knowledge and friendship with every visit we made to the Holy Land, and we let this mature until we could structure and begin anew a dialogue and a study between Jewish and Christian as children of the one God. 10 years later, we founded the Center then for the study of Christianity at the Hebrew University. And 1.5 years later, we went to this university, the Gregorian, in 2000 and created together the Cardinal Beer Center for the Jewish Studies in 2001. An active exchange between both universities came into being. It is astonishing and delightful today to see this exchange continues to grow. In this way, we took the vision of the document Nostra Aetate at the Second Vatican Council very, very seriously after 20 years to deepen this level and to bring it more forward to it. And today we are working on to develop and to studying together in a profound and sincere exchange with the next generation. The Beer Center is not only celebrating 20 years, but happily also celebrating the fact that in 2020, the Congregation of the Catholic Education granted the Gregorian University the possibility to give the first ever and only canonical licentiate in Judaic studies and Jewish-Christian relationship, which is prepared at the center. My sincere thanks to the Congregation of the Catholic Education, but surely also to the rector, Father Nuno, and for your ongoing dedication. Thank you very much, Father Nuno. And last but not least, it is also Professor Etienne Witteux with his strong and enthusiastic commitment. Thank you. As with every new beginning, there is an indwelling magic, if I may borrow Hermann Hesse, when one takes one's vision seriously, like Abraham, who firmly believed in God. It is not always easy for us today in order to think that is oriented to merit and achievement, and in our vain striving for acknowledgement to recognize the grace of God in our works. St. Paul tells us in his letter to the Roman 4 what the renewed of our activities is, and yes, is. I can therefore sincerely say that although there were times of weariness in all these 20 years and 21 years, we sometimes wanted it to lie down like Elijah under the broom tree. The right nourishment, but for the journey arrived in a wonderful manner again and again, so that we could continue together as brothers and sisters with Jews and Christian in Jerusalem and in Rome on the path to the Horeb, the mountain of God, together. That is my heartfelt wish for both centers and for all those who have come from far and from near for this annual anniversary with the theme Reading Together the Same Text, from dialogue to Jewish studies. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Aldegonde. Thank you, Mrs. Brenninkmeier, reminding us also to what extent personal relations, friendships count in this field. They are really the living milieu in which we can dialogue and we can study. Also, the quote about Elijah is quite true and helps us continue on our path. So now we will enter the second section of our evening, and I'll present the first half, which is Professor Levine and the respondent Pino Di Lucio, and then we'll have a moment of dialogue. So this will be one section. Professor Levine was professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University and is now at Hartford University. She has held quite a lot of important distinguished offices in the Society of Biblical Literature, SBL, in the Catholic Biblical Association, so this is quite extraordinary, well, not anymore in a certain way, but it was extraordinary for a Jewish scholar to be at the Catholic Biblical Association and the Association for Jewish Studies. She was, in 2019, the first Jewish scholar to teach across the street at the Pontifical Biblical, no, not the first? The first one to teach the New Testament. Okay, thanks. Which actually is quite significant also. Yes, the first Jewish scholar to teach New Testament at the Pontifical Biblical University. And in 2021, Amy Jill was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Science, so congratulations. And another thing to say is, Amy Jill and her husband, Jay Geller, who is here and also taught at the Cardinal Bea Center, arrived exactly 4 hours ago at Fiumicino University, and so we're very grateful to have them here with us. And Pino Di Lucio, I'll just continue, that way we have the whole picture. Pino Di Lucio is an Italian Jesuit, who professor now here at the Faculty of Theology in Biblical Studies. He taught also at the Pontifical Biblical University of Jerusalem and at the Pontifical Biblical Institute here in Rome, but also at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So that's quite also an extraordinary thing to have a Catholic professor teaching in Hebrew at the Hebrew University. So Pino will be giving an answer. We will be speaking now about the parables, and one parable in particular, the Good Samaritan.
Good evening. What a pleasure it is to be here. It's nice to be back. It's lovely to see my colleagues from the Biblicum. It's nice when you walk across. You should do that more often. I begin with my gratitude to my friends, and I am proud to call them friends, to Aldegonda, founding member of the Cardinal Bea Center of the Pontifical Gregorian University. So you mentioned the parable of the mustard seed. And at least in one version of the parable, the mustard seed grows into a giant tree such that the birds of heaven nest in its branches. Mustard seeds do not grow into giant trees. They grow into shrubs maybe about my height, which means that what Jesus was talking about and what you accomplished was a miracle. And miracles should be celebrated. What you have done in Jerusalem and in Rome is nothing short of miraculous. Mazel tov. Also to Etienne, my friend, it's wonderful to be able to work with you. I'm also thankful to the people who are joining us here, both in person and online. I didn't know you could do this online. It would have been so much easier. The 20th anniversary of this lecture series is a milestone to be celebrated. It is my honor to celebrate with you your investment in interreligious knowledge and understanding. So in the spirit of this investment, we'll take another look at that very familiar parable of the Good Samaritan, the story of a traveler who was critically injured by bandits on the Jerusalem to Jericho road. And while two Jews who should have stopped to help pass by, a Samaritan traveling that same road not only stops to help the injured man, but also takes him to an inn and pays the innkeeper to take care of him. Well, in antiquity, the parable was seen as an allegory. St. Augustine, for example, saw the traveler as Adam, the Samaritan as Jesus, and the priest and the Levite as the priesthood and ministry of the Old Testament, which could profit nothing for salvation. Clearly, Augustine would have profited from classes at the Cardinal Bea Center. Today, the parable is often seen as promoting charity. So we have Good Samaritan hospitals and Samaritan's Purse International Disaster Relief. Good Samaritan ministries from Australia come my friends, the Sisters of the Good Samaritans, or simply Good Sams. Australia even has a Good Samaritan donkey sanctuary. There is no donkey in the parable, by the way. The parable, understood as about aiding someone else and stripped of its Jewish context, is so familiar to American audiences that our former President George W. Bush alluded to it in his first inaugural address. President Bush stated, "I can pledge our nation to a goal. When we see that wounded traveler on the road to Jericho, we will not pass by on the other side." So for President Bush, the parable refers to international aid. Okay. I note that when I asked one of my Jewish friends if she had heard President Bush's remarks about the road to Jericho, she said it had to do with responses to a car accident in Jericho on Long Island, which is in New York. Now, this means that we Jews are not as familiar with the parables of the Jewish Jesus. Yes, he was Jewish, he was one of ours, as we should be. Margaret Thatcher reported, "No one would remember the Good Samaritan if he only had good intentions. He had money as well." For Prime Minister Thatcher, which is part of the Catholic, Anglican, and Orthodox canons, and fragments of which have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the titular hero Tobit spends the first 2 chapters of the book burying corpses left by the side of the road. This is, by the way, why the disciples of John the Baptizer claim his body, and why Joseph of Arimathea and in John's Gospel Nicodemus interred the body of Jesus. We take care of corpses. 5th, Josephus, our first-century Jewish historian, states in his book Against Apion, quote, "There are other things which are legislator," he means Moses, "ordained to us beforehand, which of necessity we ought to do in common to all, to afford fire and water and food to such as want it, to show them the roads, and not to let anyone lie unburied. He would also have us treat those that are esteemed our enemies with moderation." And we can hear here what could have been the lead up to love your enemies. It's already in the tradition. Jesus just goes the next step. 6th, the Mishnah, a later compendium of Jewish law, insists that even a high priest, if he encounters a corpse on the road, must make sure it receives a proper burial. And 7th, the Levite and priest are not following the law because the law insists on loving everyone, even the stranger, as we've just seen. Jesus gives the priest and the Levite no motivation. So why then did they pass by if purity were not the issue? The best explanation I've heard was offered by the martyred American civil rights leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King proposed, it's possible these men, the priest and the Levite, were afraid. The priest and the Levite asked, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Samaritan asks a different question. The Samaritan asks, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? And King goes on to ask, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers in Memphis, what will happen to them? Going to the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, King was assassinated. There were bandits on the road. But King, unlike the lawyer, asked the right question. Both priest and Levite asked about themselves, failed to follow the law, and failed to help a fellow child of God. So what's Jesus' first-century Jewish audience now thinking? Likely, they're asking themselves, if the priest and the Levite fail, who will act appropriately? And they've got a ready answer: we will. Why? Because Jews then and Jews now understood ourselves to be members of one of three groups. If you are a Jew, you are either a priest descended from Moses' brother Aaron. In Judaism, priesthood is an inherited position. In Catholicism, it is a vocation. Okay? So if your ancestor is Aaron, you're a priest. Or you're a Levite descended from Aaron's ancestor, Levi, Jacob's son number 3. Or you're an Israelite descended from Jacob's other children and grandchildren, and Jews by choice, then and now, are among the Israelites. List priest and Levite, and everyone knows the third will be Israelite. It would be, in fact, I can do this as an experiment, right? I'm going to give you 2 words. You give me the third. If you get this wrong, something has gone dreadfully, dreadfully wrong. Father, Son. Was that a Jewish person who said that? Yes, that's exactly right. Good. First century Jews, hearing a reference to a priest and a Levite, would presume the third person would be an Israelite, but that's not how the story goes. The traveler is not the expected Israelite, but the totally unexpected Samaritan. To go from priest to Levite to Samaritan in first century Jewish thought would be like going from father to son to Satan. The Samaritan is no Satan. He lavishes attention on the man. He bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And again, commentators miss the nuances. Common is the view that the parable warns against prejudice. The two who pass by are the pastor and the choir director, and the Samaritan is the oppressed minority or the alien. Well, that's better, since at least it moves listeners to consider their prejudices. But this reading doesn't grasp the parable's full provocation. Samaritans at the time of Jesus were not the oppressed minority group, they were the enemy. According to 2 Kings, Samaritans are descendants of the northern tribes of Israel and other groups moved into the region by its Assyrian conquerors in the 8th century BCE. The northern kingdom of Samaria and the southern kingdom of Judah were religious rivals. They each saw themselves as possessing the true text and the true form of worship. While Jews worshipped on Mount Zion, Samaritans worshipped on Mount Gerizim. Thus, the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 says to Jesus, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say the place where people must worship is Jerusalem." And to this day, Samaritans are still worshiping on Mount Gerizim. In the first century, under Roman rule, Jews and Samaritans generally did not get along. Some ancient manuscripts of the New Testament include the Gospel of John chapter 4, verse 9, which notes, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Josephus, our historian, reports that Samaritans were murdering Jewish pilgrims going from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south to worship in the temple. And indeed, just a chapter before our parable, Luke recounts that Jesus sought lodging in a Samaritan village, but the Samaritans refused him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. The apostles James and John proposed to call fire down from heaven to destroy the Samaritan village. Likely they were thinking of Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed for their lack of hospitality. But Jesus has a better option, because bombing a city is not a good response to the lack of hospitality. Despite the shock here, Jesus is actually borrowing from the tradition of Israel, from what the church would call the Old Testament. Our parable is anticipated by 2 Chronicles 28. The chronicler reports how Samaritans, here called the people of Israel, captured numerous thousands of Judean men, women, and children. But a Judean prophet named Oded condemns them. He says, "You've sinned against the Lord your God. These are your relatives. Hear me and send back the captives whom you've taken from your kindred." And 2 Chronicles 28:15 reads like a first draft of our parable. Those who were mentioned by name got up and took the captives, and with the booty they clothed all that were naked among them. They gave them sandals, they provided them with food and drink, they anointed them, and carrying all the feeble among them on donkeys, they brought them to their kindred in Jericho, the city of palm trees. The lawyer asked, "Who is my neighbor?" But Jesus changes the question. At the end, he says not, "Who is my neighbor?" but "Who proved neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The poor lawyer cannot bring himself to say Samaritan, but he gets the right answer, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus says, "You go and do likewise." Because what's of ultimate import is not who we are, but what we do. And finally, we look from ancient texts to present contexts. So here's my Jewish reading. The ancient city of Samaria was located in the area today northwest of the Palestinian city of Nablus on the West Bank, territory that has been under Israel's control since 1967. Here's the parable in modern terms. I'm an Israeli Jew waylaid by robbers, and while two people who should have helped, a member of Likud and a member of Yesh Atid, fail, a Palestinian from Nablus, offers aid. If we can picture this scenario, and if people in the Middle East can picture it, there may be hope for peace, because the stakes in being able to ask the right questions and to act as neighbor are higher than they ever were. Interpreting the parable as a lesson about compassion or helping the marginal or even about care for donkeys is fine. But knowing its historical Jewish context, we hear the challenge. The parable proposes that the person we might think is going to kill us, the enemy Samaritan, is the only one who is going to save us. One does not have to worship Jesus as Lord to learn that from him, and he has much more to teach. It's my honor to speak with you. Thanks once again for inviting me.
This will be in Italian. Yeah.
The excellent lecture by Professor Levine leads us to appreciate very especially the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the Brenning by Verhan lectures. And I, with you, wish to thank Aldegonde Verhan Brenninkmeier and Professor Witte for this. I remember with gratitude the many people involved in the activities of the Cardinal Beer Center over the last 20 years, in particular the husband of Aldegonde Hubert. With the presentation of the Jewish Annotated New Testament on 28th of March 2019, Professor Levine taught us to read the New Testament in its Judaic context. Today, she has shown us that the New Testament texts can be very topical in the 21st century, not only for Jews. I don't remember whether at the presentation of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which Professor Levine referred to implicitly this evening, there followed a lunch or a dinner. At that time, in any case, Professor Levine spoke to us about her encounter with Pope Francis, to whom she gifted a copy of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, and joking, she told us that she would like to become Pope. I checked whether this was true, and she confirmed that this actually, she still wants to become Pope. I don't know whether she's joking or not. Being Pope at this time, as we know, is not easy, and therefore we don't know whether we should hope that Professor Levine actually sees this wish accomplished. We're very happy that she helps us to actualize the message of the New Testament, contextualizing it as she did this evening when commenting the words of the lawyer who asked Jesus what he needs to do to inherit eternal life. It's pointed out that Torah is not something, a list, a to-do list, but it is an instruction for daily life. The parable of the Good Samaritan is the actualization of a teaching of the Torah for daily life, an actualization of the interpretation of the commandment of the love on the love of God. In Luke, the commandment is quoted and explained by the lawyer. In other synoptic gospels, the question of the interlocutors of Jesus focuses on the first and greatest commandment of the law, and the answer with the quotation and the explanation of the commandment comes from Jesus himself. And in Mark, it's repeated by his interlocutor, a scribe. The interpretation of the commandment of the love of God is something which is borne witness to by Qumran texts, by the Septuagint and by the Synoptic and Rabbinic traditions, and focuses particularly on how to love the Lord. In some cases, as in Luke and other Synoptic Gospels, which are on the screen, we by a listing of the faculties which in the Judaic test should be involved in the love of God: heart, soul, strength, and we find a fourth one there, the intelligence or the mind, the anoia. This term could, on the one hand, represent the totality of the love of God, which can exclude nothing and no one. On the other hand, explain one of the three faculties in Deuteronomy 6:5. The wise scribes have dealt widely with this interpretation. I put a text on the interpretation of life and the strength. In the Gospels, the commandment of God's love with the interpretations which include love with intelligent or intelligent love is explained, joining it with the commandment of love for one's neighbor, following the rule of the Gezer Shava. According to this rule, the meaning of a biblical text can be found by connecting it with another biblical text where we have the same term, which in our case is loving.
Più grande, quello.
The greatest commandment, that of love for God, is thus explained with that the one of love for the neighbor, which thus becomes the greatest commandment, as Professor Levine reminded us by quoting Rabbi Akiva in Sifre, the book of Leviticus, and also in St. Paul. We know that we find in the letter to the Romans, chapter 13, we find the same. In Luke's Gospel, the parable of the good man explains the love of God and neighbor with the compassion of the Samaritan. This is the word that recurs. Last bit is the word that is recurring for Jesus, as all his disciples will repeat in many texts of the Testament. Love is concrete. There is no love of God without love of neighbor. Love of God has to be manifested, said the professor. To love means to act. But who is the neighbor to be loved? This is the challenge of the parable. Professor Levine said that with this question, the lawyer wanted to test Jesus by asking him to parse the distinctions between the insiders and the outsiders. The parable of the Good Samaritan, as Professor Levine mentioned, has a parallel in the episode of the time of Akkad, the invitation of the prophet Oded to the inhabitants of Samaria not to subjugate the Jewish prisoners. And the parable of the Good Samaritan can be the original actualization, a sort of a reversal, which is a characteristic of Lucan parables of that episode, so as to explain and actualize the commandment of love. In the parable, it is not only a matter or a question of recognizing the generosity of the Samaritan enemy, who in the biblical text takes care of the Jewish prisoner, clothes him, gives him food, drink, medicates him with anointings, and leads him to Jericho, but rather to see in the Samaritan a foreigner, an enemy, a neighbor, and according to the professor, recognizing in him an Israelite, a son of the people, a proselyte, which a Jewish reader expects after the mention of the priest and the Levite. This is a detail that stands out even more if the parable had been originally a further update to the interpretation of the commandment to love God with love to neighbors. In the first two canonical Gospels, with the command to love one's neighbor, that is Leviticus 19, Jesus, and not the doctor of the law, we see that Jesus interprets and concretizes the command to love God in an adjectival way with the love of our neighbor, Leviticus 19, and in a modal way, as I were to do according to the golden rule. The neighbor in question is the first and foremost closest one, although later the Levitical text speaks of love for the resident foreigner, the so-called ger, with the explanation and the actualization of the adverbial value of the how to love one's neighbor, that is, with a certain way of seeing and loving that is compassion. The parable of the Good Samaritan explains the adjectival value in Leviticus 19:18, thus actualizing the interpretation of the commandment to the evangelization of the Samaritans, in which Luke himself in Acts 8, apart from the fourth Gospel, John 4, and Professor also said, and here we see that Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. In the first communities of Jesus' disciples, the words about the greatest commandment of the law and the value of the term as in Leviticus 19:18, we see that the value of term as may have been actualized with the parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable can actualize, that is to say that in the first communities of Judeo-Christians, to which the Samaritans were added, the interpretation that Jesus and the doctor of law give to the command of the God's love, explaining both the modal and the adjectival value of the as, Leviticus 19. So who is the neighbor to be loved, and for what reason, and how to love one's neighbor in order to practice the love of God? Luke, disciple of St. Paul, explains that he who with the love of God loves his neighbor, that of his group, will love not only the resident stranger, the ger, but also the enemy. So in the word rea, we see also the ra, as Professor Levitt said. He who knows how to love, loves everyone, because love bridges differences. This is what the professor told us. Luke is not inventing the universalism of Jesus. He explains and actualizes the concreteness and realism of God's love, which makes the sun rise on the good and not the bad. The parable of the Good Samaritan is highlighting Jesus' realism, the concreteness and totality of the love of which he speaks, and his understanding of God's love. This parable is intended to show that the person who is considered a stranger, different, and an enemy is not only a brother to be loved, but a brother because he knows how to love. The Samaritan, although different, is not a stranger because he's capable of the love which is required by the commandment. Professor Levine captured well when he says that the parable teaches that what is of ultimate importance is not what we are, our social class, ethnic group, religious view, politics. What is important is what we do, how we will live. So in his concreteness and his realism, to bring biblical text up to the date, the Pope, in his recent encyclical Fratelli, chose this very parable as the example of fraternity and social friendship. And here I quote, the parable shows us with which initiative a community can be rebuilt, starting from men and women who make the fragility of others their own, who do not allow a society of exclusion to be built, but who become neighbors and lift up and rehabilitate the fallen man, because so as to have the good may become a common good. Now, both Professor Levine and the Pope, as we can see, are modernizing the parable of Good Samaritan, and they are both concrete and realistic, just like the love of God explained by Jesus. At least in this, therefore, the professor may see herself as Pope, or at least as Pope Francis. So once again, to our professor for her beautiful conference, and to all of you for your beautiful lecture and patience.
Thank you, Pino. Thank you, Father Di Lucio. This is a very difficult and frustrating moment right now because, as you realize, we are running late. And we would love to discuss with the two speakers, but I think that if we do this, nobody will be on time for dinner, and this in Rome is very important. So what we'll do is just ask Professor Levine if she has something to respond or something to say about Father Di Lucio's presentation, and then we'll go directly towards the other set.
There's much richness and wisdom in your comments, regardless of the Pope thing. What I particularly appreciated is the notice of the addition of the term mind to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and the New Testament adds in mind, and the connection of that to action, because the mind allows us to choose what to do. So even if we don't feel an emotional attachment to someone who would be our enemy, the text tells us that we have the rational capability of acting in love, and if following that acting, a stronger feeling comes about, that's good, but the important thing is that we begin with the action. So I think you're bringing the mind in together with Fratelli Tutti, and what the text actually says in terms of action is a very nice next step that I wish I had made. Thank you very much for your kind words.
Thank you so much. We're just going to go directly to the next speaker, who has just accepted to speak only 20 minutes. I'm sorry for him. We'll have Father Christian Rutishauser, Professor Rutishauser, Swiss Jesuit, who will speak about a modern contemporary Jewish author. Christian Rutishauser was the provincial of the Jesuits in Switzerland, and he is the new delegate for schools and universities of Central European province. He's also a consultor of the Commission for Religious Relation to the Jews at the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Promoting Christian Unity. Father Hoffmann is here. Thank you for being here. The response will be given by Professor Karma Ben Yohanan, who is now teaching in Berlin. She holds the new chair in Jewish-Christian relations at the Faculty of Theology of the Humboldt Universität, but she is Israeli. We've been working together for quite a long time, and I'm happy also to greet her here. And it's better late than never. Professor Rutishauser, please.
Thanks so much for the invitation to deliver this lecture. I'm Swiss, and the Swiss try to be punctual. If I will deliver the lecture only in 20 minutes, I don't know, but I try to do it. It's an honor to deliver this lecture and to work with and for the center. It was always an institution of in-depth Jewish-Christian dialogue, and I'm sure it will be, and it is already, an institution for in-depth Jewish-Christian studies. We are now going in a completely different world, into the world of philosophy. I have chosen for this lecture a text written by Rav Dov Soloveitchik, Halakhic Man, a text I interpret as a Jewish self-assurance with inspirational power for a Christian. Rav Soloveitchik concludes his almost 140 pages philosophical essay, Halakhic Man, published in 1944 with the statement that my sole intention was to defend the honor of the Halakha and Halakhic men, for both it and they have oftentimes been attacked by those who have not penetrated into the essence of Halakha and have failed to understand the Halakhic personality. End of quote. He thus presents an apologetic text, but not in a defensive, despairing, in an inane manner that would not be on the level of high philosophical reflection. Rather, he defends dignity and beauty of the Halakhic existence in the face of modernity's philosophy and psychology of religion. He limits their claim. He situates them in the history of thought and creates space for an alternative religious self-understanding in secular culture. Modernity can only understand religion, if at all, as an anthropological feature. The Halakha, however, as much as it is unfolded and developed by the sages, is in itself understanding of Orthodox Judaism a reality given from Sinai, and in this sense, not only a cultural phenomenon. Soloveitchik does not defend the Halakhic way of life against a secular atheistic worldview. He demarcates it from a philosophical religious self-understanding that has developed in the cultural environment of modern Judaism. A philosophy that reduces religion to a subjective faith process and serves the aesthetic need and psychological feeling of the schlechtsinnige Abhängigkeit, so to speak, with Friedrich Schleiermacher, has, according to Soloveitchik, also contaminated Judaism. In general, mysticism has penetrated Judaism since the Middle Ages and has overlaid the centrality of the halakhic ethical in Jewish orthodoxy. Soloveitchik sets himself apart from this halakhic man. He writes against a Kabbalistically influenced orthodoxy and against the early Musar movement. That means his demarcation does not follow the classical Jewish denominations, Orthodox, Haredim, Masorti, Liberal, and so on. In Halakhic Man, he portrays a whole specific Orthodox school, his Prisker family tradition. She belongs to the Mitnagdim, the Litvaks. In her Talmudic studies, she is characterized by a highly formalized halakhic methodology, by philosophical reflection, and by its orientation towards Maimonides as the author of the Mishneh Torah as well as the Moreh Nevuchim. Halakhic Man also contains polemical passages towards Christianity and the Church. Reading them as a Christian, as I do, they have never diminished my interest in the essay. I read over the two sweeping statements, or rather gladly forgive Soloveitchik for them. Christians should reflect on his philosophical arguments and his criticism on the romantic idealistic understanding of religion. A Christian may reject or integrate them self-critically into the own theological thinking. Also, a Christian must position himself in view of the modern and topologically oriented conception of faith and religion. In reading Halakhic Man, he learns how the other does it, a Jewish Orthodox intellectual. Especially a Roman Catholic can neither uncritically adopt the philosophy and psychology of religion of the 19th and the 20th century. They have grown out of a liberal Lutheran theology. They spread an apparently scientifically based understanding of religion. However, faith is thereby dissolved into history and psychology. In short, the halakhic self-assurance of Halakhic Man also inspires a Christian and helps him to position himself in the modern age. In Soloveitchik, he learns about structural analogies in terms of self-understanding, about access to the world, and the assessment of religion, of philosophy, and anthropology. He also encounters a rich interpretation of Talmudic texts and learns a theological interpretation of Jewish liturgical prayers and holiday customs. So let's go to the text. In the first part of Halakhic Man, Soloveitchik draws the contours of the Halakhic Man ideal typically, not empirically. The portrait he draws does not correspond to a real existing human being, even though he illustrates it with examples from his family tradition. In addition, Soloveitchik proceeds dialectically by contrasting Halakhic Man with two other types, Homo religiosus and cognitive man. All three ideal types are ideal types. Neither the religious self-conception of romanticism and idealism represented by Homo religiosus, nor the scientifically proceeding of cognitive man with its functionalist reason grasps the basic structure of the Halakhic Man. Soloveitchik outlines a third form of existence, a kind of synthesis of the two with a greater tendency towards rational, scientifically oriented man. In the second part of the essay, Soloveitchik takes his cue from Maimonides' Moreh Nevuchim. He describes an ideal typical halakhic personality formation. It begins with conversion of the human being who is able to shape time creatively and freely. The relationship to time is crucial because the determined causal chain must be broken to escape the curse, guilt, and fate of the past. The status of a rasha, an evildoer, must be overcome through self-creation. This is real teshuvah, repentance, Soloveitchik speaks so often about. Then, in a second step, man can open himself to the reason of halakha. This happens in Talmud Torah Lishma, in Talmud study for its own sake, as well as in its normative practical halakhic unfolding. The theoretical development of halakha, as well as its implementation in everyday life, takes place through the Jew opening himself to divine providence. The potential inherent in him as a human being to create himself and the world through halakhic ideals and spiritual formulas is thus realized. He who does teshuvah and allows himself to be guided by God's providence arrives at prophecy. This is not charismatic rapture. It is pure intellectual grasp of reality through the categories of halakha. It is precisely in this supreme act of Jewish Orthodox existential fulfillment that Soloveitchik remains faithful to the Maimonidean concept of the union of the active divine and the passive human intellect. Soloveitchik describes a religious personality oriented towards natural seeing and shaping the world. He ingeniously combines the philosophical tradition of Maimonides, the philosophy of time and freedom, as well as the imperative for existential self-realization. Following Martin Buber, who spoke of a Hebrew humanism, one can speak of a halakhic humanism in halakhic man. Not the Hebrew language or Jewish history are the determining principles of personality formation, but the idealistically conceived spiritual world of the halakha. Let us even look more closely how Soloveitchik describes halakhic man. Homo religiosus is fascinated and terrified by the experience of the world at the same time. He perceives the enigmatic and mysterious complexity of reality. He tries to interpret it, to penetrate it, and to wrest meaning from it. In this way, he reaches into the experience of the mystical and of the reflection of transcendence. In general, he wants to explore factual reality for its secrets. In view of its abysses and the experience of misery in the world, he also wants to transcend it. The rational approach to reality of the natural scientist, who is fascinated by general cause-effect relationship, who explores the empirical world out of curiosity, describes the laws of nature and subjugates reality through objectification, is unsatisfactory to him. He lacks a sense of the subjective, the unique and the ambiguous. The aesthetic experience as well as the emotional experience are missing for him in the calculating and functional approach to reality. The cognitive process itself, which is to the scientist an unquestioned tool for grasping the world, is a mystery to Homo religiosus. Therefore, he engages in philosophical hermeneutics. Now, according to Soloveitchik, halakhic man has the same experience of reality as Homo religiosus, but he responds to it more like a cognitive man. He acts like a rational man, analogous to a natural scientist, or more precisely, like a mathematician. He does not strive for transcending experience, but turns to everyday reality. To this end, he is equipped with mental concepts and structures, ideas and patterns of perception, principles and a priori conceptions, which the halakha makes available to him. In abstracting reflection on the various legal questions, he develops such intellectual tools. As examples, Soloveitchik mentions, among others, the bulk of an olive, ketzait, the bulk of a date, keketovet, time required to eat a half-loaf meal, kedei achilat preas, the time required to drink a quarter log, revi'it, and so on. They are derived and developed in casuistic study through abstraction. Thus, the study of halakha issues has value in itself. This is also one reason why the halakist is concerned with questions about temple sacrifices, even though there is no longer any possibility to sacrifice in the temple today, as Soloveitchik explains. With these mental instruments, which together form an ideal mental system, like the formulas a mathematician develops, the halakhic man approaches all areas of reality. He surveys and orders, shapes and creates them, all the more in order to derive ethical normative behavior from them. He constructs a spiritual halakhic ideal reality, which he brings into correlation with concrete reality. Obeying commandments and acting according to halakha means establishing this correlation. The halakhic person's access to reality is therefore not only determined by the natural cognitive abilities of the human being, the entire hermeneutic capacity for comprehension, intellectual reflection, and abstraction are constitutively shaped by the halakha as a spiritual system. Moreover, every grasp of reality, every cognition is directed towards producing an instruction for action. The halakist is not only in the service of knowledge, he is always also the servant of an ethical way of life, which is oriented towards norms and commandments, towards mitzvot. Soloveitchik describes, for example, how the halakhic person approaches a spring in physical reality. He has a clear concept in mind of what it is. Then he perceives the spring and immediately examines it to determine whether it is pure or not, whether it is suitable for immersing a sick person, whether it can be used as atonement water, and so on. In another example, again and again, Soloveitchik refers to the experience of a sunrise and a sunset. For him, it is the epitome of a romantic experience of nature that astonishes man and leads him to reverence for the sublime. The homo religiosus makes a religious experience out of it. For halakhic men, however, rising and setting suns are not primarily an aesthetic experience. For the halakist, this would be too reductionist. Rather, the sunrise and the sunset remind him of the commandments to be associated with the corresponding day, the recitation of the Shema, the putting on of tefillin and tzitzit, the blowing of the shofar, of fasting, and so on. In general, the halakhic way of life is not about raising the soul to higher spheres. In this way, Soloveitchik not only opposes religious experiences as the cornerstone of an existence of faith, but also Jewish mysticism. Thus, the performance of mitzvot does not have to relate to intentions to influence higher powers, nor does the Shekhinah have to be freed from exile and reunited with the transcendent God. Soloveitchik radically reinterprets Kabbalistic concepts. Speaking of Zimzum, for example, is in his thinking not part of cosmogony anymore. It is not God's self-contraction to make space for creation. It is God's self-contraction to be present in the reality limited by space and time. Zimzum describes God present in the proverbial 4 cubits of halakha, in the concrete performances of the halakhic commandments of an individual. What does all this mean, this Jewish self-understanding, for a Christian, for a Catholic? the very understanding of sin sum that has been described echoes, for example, the Christian belief in incarnation. The structural similarity lies in the fact that the religious and spiritual movement is from transcendence towards the concrete world and not vice versa. Of course, Soloveitchik rejects the Christian idea of incarnation. For him, it is much too static, too substantial, and too exclusively conceived to Jesus. Yet, the faith in incarnation also describes a movement from God to creation and not the other way around, perceives created reality positively, a view that is very important to Soloveitchik and which he repeatedly emphasizes against a mysticism that flees from the world. In the halakhic carrying out, the worldliness of the religious existence should be creatively shaped according to rational principles. In analogy, the movement of incarnation is also meant to bring redemption, salvation to this concrete world. Through reading Soloveitchik halakhic self-understanding, the Christian is encouraged to understand his faith in the incarnation neither merely as a theoretical belief in Jesus Christ, nor merely ontologically in terms of its essence. Rather, faith in the incarnation is to be understood as an invitation to the imitation of God. It invites Christians to let themselves be sent into the world like Christ, to shape it in a salvific way. Soloveitchik may understand action in the world as more creative, whereas the Christian understands incarnational action as more redemptive and healing. If the former is more juridical normative, the latter is more ethical, therapeutic, or caritative. In any case, incarnation as an action-oriented view of faith corresponds exactly to the view of the Jesuits, for example, who invite in their spirituality to a imitatio incarnationis. I skip a paragraph. Beyond to learn the self-image of a halakhic man that Soloveitchik draws, it is worthwhile for a Christian to read Soloveitchik's halakhic man. The reader passes by numerous theological questions and learns how they are treated from a Jewish Orthodox perspective. For example, Soloveitchik describes tradition as a collective consciousness of time in which every Orthodox Jew participates. Tradition is not history. Rather, it links eternity with the experience of temporality. The creation of Shabbat, the Exodus, the gift of the Torah at Mount Sinai, and so on, are inscribed in the timeless consciousness of the time through memory. The past becomes present. At the same time, it opens towards the eschatological Shabbat and future redemption. New events are included in the eternal tradition because it is not static. And halakhic renewal, the chidush, sought and celebrated, turns out to be the discovery of an eternal spiritual truth. Soloveitchik writes, "We have here a blurring of the boundary dividing time from eternity, temporal life from everlasting life." To speak in terms of religious philosophy, smaller references to transcendence, the commemoration of the past and future events which transcend the present moment, are combined with the larger references to transcendence, the concept of eternity. I come to my end with a last example of a theological topic, very important. In connection with understanding of time, so central to the Jewish as well as the Christian approach to life, Soloveitchik also addresses the question of mortality and immortality of the human being. Following Maimonides, he explains that for a philosopher today, as for Aristotle once, every individual and every creature is mortal. Only the species as a whole and pure ideas are immortal. Consequently, man is mortal. However, man is not only a biological being like any other. Soloveitchik calls him man of God. This is not understood to be a second, immortal, ontological disposition of man. Soloveitchik does not speak here of the man created in the image of God. This would be understood too ontologically. Nor does he speak of an immortal soul. Man's passive intellect, Soloveitchik follows the language of Maimonides, must be rather consciously choose existence as a man of God. His immortality depends on his acting. Only insofar as he lives ethically normatively, is creatively active, does good and takes responsibility, does he make himself immortal. Not a soul, no matter how ethereal, guarantees man's eternity. Only creative action, only the righteous act is stronger than death. Soloveitchik's focus on the carrying out, on the normative and ethical, is also highly stimulating for Christian faith. After all, Jesus died as a righteous man. Because he acted righteously, God raised him from the dead. Resurrection is a matter of justice and not of ontology, as the belief in the immortal soul. Belief in immortality of the soul does not actually require a God who acts in death. The concept of the immortal soul may even be part of an atheistic worldview. According to Soloveitchik, judgment in the moment of dying is not externally applied to the soul. The ethical behavior of man does constitute itself. This view resonates with the Gospel of John. John 3:18, he that believes on him is not condemned, but he that believes not is condemned already. Because no human being is completely righteous in his acting, Christian faith speaks of man being saved by the righteousness of Jesus Christ, who completes human failure. How does Soloveitchik respond to the real human being, failing short of the ideal type of halakhic man he draws? This is not clear from his essay. A classical conversation about ethics and grace would be appropriate, about individual responsibility and intergenerational merit. It is not the place to open this discussion now. I have rather to conclude my lecture with a glimpse to such an exciting question. Soloveitchik's essay is a grandiose self-assurance for an Orthodox Jew of the modern age. For a Christian, it is more than inspiring. It challenges theological, interreligious debates, even if Soloveitchik himself was reluctant to engage into them. Thanks for your attention.
We'll go without transition to the response, and we won't have a discussion afterwards. We'll just wrap up. I think that what Professor Ben Yohanan will say will probably be the discussion itself.
Good evening. As you've heard, I'm an Israeli, but I live in Germany, so I will also try to be punktlich. Maybe more than my Swiss friend. We will have to see. So before beginning my short response to Professor Ruti Sauser, dear Christian, I would like to express my thanks to Professor Veto and to Mrs. Aldegona-Brennmeier that I finally met for the invitation to take part in this special event and to celebrate with all of you, both here and in Jerusalem, this exciting anniversary of the Cardinal Bea Center. Over the years, the center has been and still is very dear to me as a place where unique, strong and inspiring intellectual friendships evolve, a place of true reciprocity, curiosity, and an open mind to study each other and even more so, to study together. I'm honored and happy to be part of this special community. A Jesuit reads Soloveitchik. Christian Rutisauser did not choose to speak today about Martin Buber, nor about Franz Rosenzweig, nor even about Yitz Greenberg or Michael Wischergrod. In other words, Professor Rutisauser chose to engage not with a Jewish thinker who is overtly dialogical, whose stated purpose is to bridge the gaps between Christianity and Judaism. In many ways, Soloveitchik's approach is the exact opposite. Not to find common ground, but to stress the singularity of the Jewish experience, even to keep it from being reduced or abstracted from its unique Jewish context for the sake of dialogue. Soloveitchik's hesitation towards Jewish-Christian dialogue is well known, of course, from his famous essay, Confrontation, which was written in 1964 when the Second Vatican Council was still taking place. In this article, this leader of modern Orthodoxy warned his Jewish readers from an over-eagerness for Jewish-Christian dialogue, which risks at compromising the singularity of the faith community. Halakha, doctrine, ritual, and eschatological formulations belong, so Soloveitchik argued in his essay, to the intimate realm of the faith community and should not be compared or reduced to the experience of another faith community. The danger that Soloveitchik identified in interfaith dialogue pertained especially to the Jewish relationship with Christianity, since the Judeo-Christian affinity could be easily manipulated into a supersessionistic, asymmetrical encounter between subject and object, that is, between a Christian subjectivity that sees Judaism as an object of Christian thought. In Soloveitchik's words, we are not ready for a meeting with another faith community in which we shall become an object of observation, judgment, and evaluation. And later, we do not revolve as a satellite around any orbit. As a text focusing on Jewish-Christian relations, Confrontation, notwithstanding all its reservations towards Jewish-Christian dialogue, is the Soloveitchik text that has been most widely read among Christians. Yet Christian here did not choose to discuss Soloveitchik's Jewish-Christian essay, but rather engaged with another, earlier Soloveitchik text, Halachic Men, a work dedicated precisely to that singular Jewish experience, or more precisely, to that singular Jewish Orthodox experience, or even more precisely, to the unique Brisker Jewish Orthodox experience of confronting the world through the lens of Halakha. Halakha, naturally, is the Jewish realm or literary genre which was always and still is less accessible to Christians. Midrash, liturgy, even Kabbalah have drawn much more Christian curiosity than the hair-splitting legal discussions of Abaye and Rabbah, which remain generally alien to Christian spirituality. This is, of course, an understatement, for traditionally halachic law represented the most intolerable aspect of Judaism for Christianity and the epitome of Jewish intransigence. It was the negative of Christianity, a negative which was, until not long ago, read into the Pauline epistles as a dichotomy between law and faith. The Christian category of legalism, which later evolved into a philosophical category, too, as in Kant, was the strongest aspect of otherness in the Jewish tradition and the strangest to Christian selfhood. As an Israeli interested in Catholic theology, I was often asked the following: what does a nice Jewish girl like you doing studying all this Catholic theology? As a paraphrase, we could ask here, what does a nice Jesuit like Christian Rutisauser doing studying halachic men? Why, in other words, does Professor Rutisauser find it beneficial to discuss particularly this aspect of Judaism, to engage with Soloveitchik precisely on this point? Rutisauser opens his engagement with halachic men with a statement that this is an apologetic text, defending, I quote, the dignity and the beauty of halachic existence in face of modernity's philosophy of religion and psychology of religion. By criticizing these modern perceptions of religion, Ruti Sauser argues, halachic men thus craft a space for Orthodox Jewish existence within a secular culture. The need to craft such a space is well known to Catholics as well, since the Catholic experience, as Christian explains, is also reduced when it is seen through the prism of the classical modern perception of religion as an anthropological feature. Thus, the question, how does a religious mind respond to an outside observation that seeks to define it, to measure it, to categorize and evaluate it, is a common question for both modern Orthodox Jews and for Catholics, who are, to a great extent, modern Orthodox in their own right. Soloveitchik's halachic men, however, can be read in more than one way. On the surface, at least, it does not necessarily strive to refute the modern perception of religion altogether, nor to counter its theoretical basis. Soloveitchik is merely introducing another religious type into the existing modern typology of religion, a type whose religious experience is not mystical or emotional, but based on a cognitive, halachic reasoning, mathematical in its spirit. Soloveitchik, in this regard, makes room for halachic men within the variety of religious experience, to borrow William James's term. When read this way, Soloveitchik's move is one of inclusion of the halachic experience within the philosophy, the phenomenology, and the anthropology of religion, within what these fields can examine. Stressing the singularity of the halachic experience in this sense is a move towards discharging the otherness of the halakha in order to make it fitting for the modern perception of religion, and not one towards pointing to the inadequacy of that perception in principle. Yet Christian presents a reading of halachic men which does something even more radical. He reminds us that those modern theories of religion are not groundless, objective, eternally true perceptions, but that they themselves grew out of a specific religious worldview on the foundations of liberal Protestant theology in the 19th and early 20th century. Returning the theory of religion to its theological roots, Christian subverts under the division of labor between the secular scientific subject and the religious as the object of science, so that right from the outset, we are looking at two alternative views on faith that have, so to say, equal footing. Within this debate, which is now intra-theological, halachic men does not merely serve to soften the otherness of Jewish halakha in order to make it more accessible to the secular subject. Rather, halachic otherness serves as a tool to challenge the universalist sameness of the theory that reduces the religious to a specific psychological and emotional experience. It is precisely that legalism as the despised other of a certain perception of Christian faith which Ruti Sauser sees as a basis for an alternative perception of Christian selfhood, of Christian faith, that does not concede to identify itself with the Schleiermacherian feeling of schlechtsinnige Abhängigkeit. We just didn't find the English for that, I'm sorry. Nor sees itself as diametrically opposed to Jewish law. Christian, therefore, perceives Catholic faith as closer to the halakha than to the aesthetic and the psychological idea of faith in both its beginnings and in its ends. In its beginnings, since both Catholics and halachic men a la Soloveitchik insist on a divine origin which is beyond human subjectivity. In its ends, because both insist on transcending the limits of the subjective and intimate experience of the individual by acting in the world. In other words, instead of posing law and faith against each other, Christian brings together the Catholic experience and the Jewish Orthodox experience, as well as a Protestant experience in Barthian style, to construct a response, to return a critical gaze to the reductionist gaze which secular theories of religion direct at religious forms of existence, which do not align themselves with, to quote Christian again, the modern anthropologically oriented new conception of faith. If to go back to Soloveitchik's confrontation, it seems that Soloveitchik's reservations vis-à-vis a subject-object relationship between Christians and Jews is mirrored in Professor Ruti-Schauser's critique of the objectifying gaze of modern science on religious faith. Thus, the encounter of a Jesuit with this modern Orthodox text counters at one and the same time classical Christian supersessionism towards Judaism and modern secular scientific supersessionism towards religion. This way, the binary distinction between the subject and the object, whether it is a Christian subject that looks at Judaism or a modern secular subject that looks at religion, is being transformed side by side with the distinction between faith and law into a conversation among equals who are able to look back at each other. Thank you very much.
We can feel that the speakers will probably continue to discuss this after the evening. We could have taken 2 days. I'll just say one sentence as a conclusion. Without entering into the contents, I have been very impressed by the knowledge of the other tradition of each of our speakers. And I have the impression, for example, as a Christian, I've learned a lot, but both about Judaism, but also about Christianity this evening. I hope it's the same thing for the Jewish participants this evening. And we would not have been able to do this without each other. We would not have been able to do this. So I think this is what I can learn from this evening. If you still want to discuss with the speakers, it's possible. Tomorrow there will also be a course more than a conference, a lecture given by Professor Levine. I don't know if it's still possible to register. If people want to, you can go see Louisa, who's dressed in white up here and standing up. And two things, concrete things. There's a bookshop, or there are books being sold. The choice is simply that different professors of the Bea Center have been writing in these books, and 2 are actually a series that is co-launched with the Bea Center and Pauline Editions. And one person from this morning's small conference has left with the headset, or with the radio of the headset. I hope you still have it in your bag or your pocket, and we'll be happy to find it again. Okay. And so thank you for participating. We've been happy to be with you, and as you say in Rome, buonasera, buon appetito anche, and hope to see you again.